24th Albany Planning and Zoning Commission hearing. We will now call this meeting to order. Agenda item 2, roll call.
Commissioner Donaldson? Oh. Commissioner Kent?
Okay, I guess I'm here.
Commissioner McLeod?
Here.
Commissioner Jennings?
Here.
Chair Waddy?
Here. Thank you. That brings us to item 3 on our agenda, which are ex parte communications. Do any commissioners have any ex parte communications to disclose tonight?
Not I.
No.
Seeing none, that will move us on to item 4 on our agenda, which is the consent calendar. The consent calendar items are considered to be routine and will be enacted on by one motion. Approval of the consent calendar. The staff recommendations will be adopted unless otherwise modified by the commission or requested to be pulled off by a member of the public. And do we have any members of the public who have expressed to speak on any of the consent calendar items? Or I guess I should first, I'll read through the 2 items first. First up, we have item 4-1, Planning and Zoning Commission meeting minutes of May 27th. Item 4-2, Planning Application 20-012, Design Review and Parking Reduction at 1148 Garfield. And item 4-3, Planning Application 20-023, Design Review and Parking Exception at 629 Stannage.
And to remind the members of the public, if you would like to speak on an item, please click the raise your hand icon, or if you're participating by telephone, please press *9. I don't see any hands right now.
Okay. Fellow commissioners?
Steve,
oh, now there's one.
Okay. Steve, which item are you requesting to be pulled off the consent calendar?
Oh, okay. It's not on the consent calendar. I'm sorry. I want to talk about Evelyn Avenue. I apologize.
Okay, we'll get to that a little later on the agenda.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, so seeing that there are no members of the public, are there any commissioners who wish to pull any of these items off the consent calendar? All right, seeing none.
No, I'm fine with the consent calendar tonight.
Okay, great. Do we have a motion to move the consent calendar?
I will move to approve the consent calendar for tonight. 4 items.
I'll second that.
All right, with that motion, we'll do individual commissioner votes. So Commissioner Jennings.
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson.
Aye.
Commissioner Kent.
Aye.
And Commissioner McLeod.
Aye.
And I too vote to approve the consent calendar, so that the consent calendar is approved unanimously. And sorry, and do any of these have story polls up that we need to remind folks to keep up through the appeal period?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. So just a reminder to everyone that there is a 14-day appeal period on both items 4-2 and 4-3. With that, we'll go to item 5 on our agenda, which is general public comment. General public comment is for members of the public who wish to address the commission on an item that is not otherwise agendized this evening. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak on an item not agendized tonight?
No hands raised.
With that, public comment is closed. And that will bring us to item 6 on our agenda, which is discussion and possible action, action items. First up is item 6-1. This is a study session of planning application 20-019, density bonus and design review for a new 14-unit apartment building at 423 Evelyn Avenue. And do we have a staff presentation this evening?
Yes, hi, this is Jean Iceberg, the contract planner for this item. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see that.
Yes.
So this is a pre-application, a study session. No action will be taken tonight for 423 Evelyn Avenue. The site location is between Evelyn and the Ohlone Greenway, just north of Brighton Avenue. The El Cerrito BART station is just a few blocks to the north. The general plan and zoning designation allow for a multifamily residential use here. It's a 9,325 square foot site. There's an existing 4-unit structure that was built in 1960 on the property. And there are several legal nonconformities on the site. It's legally nonconforming with respect to lot width, which is 37.5 feet, where typically a lot is a minimum of 50 feet, as well as the front and side setback, the front daylight plane. It's also nonconforming with respect to parking backup distance because of that lot width, as well as bike parking and open space. Just a few photos. This is the front of the property on the left side of the screen. You're seeing that 4-unit building, and then also looking east from behind that building, the surface parking lot in the middle of the site, and then a vacant portion of the site in the back. And then you see the BART aerial and the Ohlone Greenway in the background. Looking west on the site, this is the back of that existing apartment, and then looking west on the right-hand side of this frame, looking west from the Ohlone Greenway onto the site and past the chain link fence. So the proposal is to retain the existing 4-unit building on the site, which is shown on the left side of the screen in the section, and then add 14 multifamily units in a 4-story walk-up, so a total of 18 units on the site. 2 of the units would be below market rate units, 1 for very low income households and 1 for low income households. There is a proposal to retain the existing parking on the site, those existing 6 spaces, but reconfigure them, turning them 90 degrees to allow for a conforming backup distance. So there would technically 4 parking spaces would serve the existing building, and then 2 parking spaces are provided for the new building. And I'll talk a little bit more about the reduction in parking later in the presentation. Additionally, private open space is provided for the 2 ground floor units, totaling 500 square feet. There's no open space provided for the upper story unit. There is common access to the Ohlone Greenway along the side yard on the north side of the site. In terms of bike parking, there's 14 covered bike parking spaces meeting the code requirement just inside the lobby in a room. And then there are 7 additional bike racks provided in the rear of the building, which would provide bike access for both residents of the existing building and of the new building. In terms of open space, I've pulled out the code section here to clarify this, but the code requires 200 square feet of common open space per unit, or 100 square feet of private open space per unit, or some combination. So the code provides some examples of how this can be provided in combination. But the short story here is that the open space is only being provided for the ground floor units. In this case, it does exceed that 100 square feet per unit, but it's only provided for those 2 units. There's no open space on the upper floors. So there's some elevations shown in the plan set. Right now, again, this is a preliminary application, so there's no architectural details in terms of precise colors or materials, and those would come with the formal application. But you can see the elevations here. And I just want to point out, in the north elevation, there are much smaller windows. These correspond to mostly common hallways and bathrooms and some bedrooms, whereas the south elevation has larger windows, which look into living rooms and kitchen areas. So this is a state density bonus law project. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes explaining how this works. So the base project, if we think of it as the base project, 63 units an acre is the maximum density according to the R3 zoning designation. So on a lot of this size, 14 units would be allowed. And so in this case, we've got 4 existing units, and the base project could add 10 additional units for 14 units total. The proposed project under density bonus law is requesting 18 units. So that's 4 existing units plus the 14 new units. And so in order to do that, the applicant needs a 32.5% density bonus, which under state law requires them to provide 10% of the units for very low income households. And so that math is done on just the additional 10 new units that would be provided in the base project. However, because the city of Albany has an inclusionary housing requirement of 15% of units being required for for below market rate households, there are actually 2 units that are required on this property to be eligible, to be below market rate. So one very low and one low. And so those 2 units would satisfy both the city's inclusionary requirement and the state density bonus law. Now, with the 10% of very low income units, the project is eligible for 2 concessions and an unlimited number of waivers. And so in order to build this project, the applicant is requesting waivers for 4 items. First, to increase the building height from 35 feet to 45 feet, so that's from 3 to 4 stories, to increase the FAR slightly from 1.5 to 1.6, to reduce the rear setback, and to reduce the parking space dimensions. And in terms of waivers, the city must approve waivers that would otherwise physically preclude the construction of the development project. In terms of concessions, again, the applicant's eligible for 2 concessions. They're requesting 2, one to reduce the parking requirement from 14 spaces to 2 spaces, and second, to reduce the open space requirement from 2,800 square feet to 500 square feet to satisfy the requirement for just those 2 ground floor units. In terms of the concession request, in order to deny a concession request, the city would need to prove that the project does not the concession does not represent an identifiable cost reduction for the construction of the affordable unit. In terms of policy consistency, the project meets all of the city's objective zoning standards as modified by the state density bonus law waivers and concessions, and also including the non-conforming elements that I mentioned. The project site is identified as an opportunity site in the housing element. The housing element did acknowledge that this is a narrow lot and assumed that only 5 additional units could be added here for a total of 9 on the site. So this project would both meet and exceed what was estimated in the housing element. We received 2 public comments in the last couple days. The first comment from the adjacent property owner was objecting to the height, massing, and the use of concessions for open space and parking. Also identified an adverse impact due to the lack of open space and parking that would impact on-street parking and other open space facilities off-site. And also objected to the impacts on existing off-site mature trees. So those are trees that are adjacent to the project site. The second public comment was in support of the project, particularly its density, height, the reduced parking, and the diversity of the apartment unit housing type. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. We also have the representing the project applicant, Isaiah Stackhouse, who is an attendee to the Zoom right now. Thank you.
Doug Donaldson here. I have a couple of questions. Is that okay now? Mm-hmm.
Sure, let's go ahead and take questions of staff, and then we'll turn it over to the project applicant.
Okay. Let's see. Jane, thanks for a nice presentation, actually. They're very clear and concise, and I appreciate that. I think I have 2 questions. Could you talk a little bit about the 32.5% density bonus versus a 35% density bonus? I've seen both numbers in some of the materials, and I'm a little confused as to how you got to, or how you and the architect got to this being a 32.5%. And my second question is, do you or the architect know which of the units will be designated the low-income units? Which of the units in the proposed building? Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll start with the second question because I don't know which units would be the below market rate units. The city requires that those would be identified as a part of the project approval process. The applicant may be able to answer that question tonight, but otherwise we would know when we get to the actual hearing. Second, in terms of the density bonus, so density bonus law allows a maximum of 35% density bonus. In this case, both a 35% and a 32.5% both get you, in terms of rounding, get you to the same number of 18 units. So effectively, the applicant is proposing the maximum number of units. However, just based on how the math works out, 32.5% density bonus is enough for them to achieve those 18 units.
Thank you. Mhm.
And oh, sorry, Commissioner Jennings.
Oh, yeah, sorry, just a quick follow-up on that. Jean, could you talk about the conclusion that the requirement to provide 10% very low income units to achieve that 32.5% bonus only applies to the new units and not the total number of units that would be on the site? So basically, how did staff decide that the requirement is one very low income unit required rather than two?
Okay, so we worked on this with the city attorney, and the statute for the state density bonus law does not talk about existing units on a site. And so our interpretation with the city attorney is that we should be using the 10 new units as our denominator, essentially, that those the applicant is not proposing to rehab or substantially rehab those existing units, which might change things. But in this case, that we're only assessing the 10% requirement on the new 10 units.
Okay, thanks.
Great. And I just had one question in terms of the housing element opportunity site. Can you just confirm that the housing element assumed sort of base zoning and did not factor in the ability to take advantage of density bonus? Is that accurate?
I
would say that is accurate. It did not contemplate state density bonus law. It did contemplate that this was a narrow site and that the allowable density may not be achievable.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions of staff before we turn it over to the applicant?
I have a couple questions. What is the height of the building directly to the north? Do we know that?
I don't know the height of that building. I can try to figure it out while we're still talking. It is a 4-story building, though.
In the architect's shadow or three-dimensional drawings show that the redwood tree on the Brighton house right there is staying, but it's hard to tell. I can't quite tell how close it is to the building or where it's located. Do we have a diagram or a section from the Brighton property right through the building showing the location of the redwood in relation?
We don't have the exact location. Yeah, we can see that dense brush identified on the survey, but I don't have the location of the redwood on the survey, and it's something we may want to ask for the formal application.
That's it.
Okay. Any other questions? Commissioner Jennings.
Sorry, one other one I meant to ask, which is I'm curious whether staff have looked at any precedents for the total elimination of parking. So I'm familiar, obviously, with parking reductions in connection with a density bonus request. And I know there are other jurisdictions that don't impose any parking minimums at all, but I'm not aware of any, kind of in the immediate vicinity of Albany. So I'm just curious if there's any precedent we know of where density bonus projects have received a total, elimination of parking spaces as a concession, especially in the East Bay.
I've seen reductions. This is I would say a more extensive reduction. We did talk to the applicant, and this is shown in their applicant statement, about some alternatives for what they looked at and what we suggested they look at in terms of how to create some additional parking spaces, both looking at surface parking options with a smaller project, looking at how to do structured parking. And one of the issues, again, is this narrow lot width. So in terms of the column locations in a structured parking garage, in terms of being able to actually turn around in the parking garage, that wasn't feasible. But in terms of your direct question, I'm not familiar with a project that eliminated the parking requirement altogether, but that's not to say that it doesn't exist for this type of density bonus project, but I'm not sure.
All right, Commissioner McLeod.
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me? I just wanted to follow up a similar question about the new versus existing units and how the density bonus is calculated. I mentioned this earlier to staff. Just to be very clear that the 1 unit required to qualify for the state bonus is based on the 10 unit new building and not the 14 units. I mean, I think it needs to be really, really clear going forward. And I'm encouraged that it's the city attorney's opinion that it's the 10, or at least, would rely on that. If it did turn out to be the 14, then 10% would be 1.4. And then where do you go with that? Does that become 2 units required, rounding up, or does that round down? I'm not really sure what happens with that. If it was 1.4 and had to be rounded up, then the applicant could potentially provide 2 very low income units as a solution. So it's just something to keep in mind going forward, but I wouldn't want to see the project go too far forward and then we find out the calculation has to be done differently. So that's one concern I had, and I don't know if that, I mean, you've already answered it, but I just wanted to express that. And then I was just also asking, wondering about ADA parking. There's one space shown. Now, should there be one ADA parking space for the existing unit and one for the new unit? Just as a matter of code, we could figure that out later, but it's just something I like to know going forward at some point. Thank you.
Okay. In terms of the parking requirement, I don't know about the ADA space. The architect may be able to answer that in his presentation. And then again, in terms of the below market rate units, so yes, the city attorney's interpretation right now is that the state density bonus law is assessed on the 10 units. However, again, the city's inclusionary requirement requires 2 affordable units. So as part of this proposal, 2 below market rate units are proposed, 1 at very low income level and 1 at the low income level.
All right, great. With that, why don't we turn it over to the project sponsor for their presentation. Okay, so if someone can unmute Isaiah, great, thank you.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for hosting us this evening in these unusual times and circumstances. Thank you, Jeannie, for a great presentation again. So I'm Isaiah Stackhouse, the architect with the project team. We also have David Trachtenberg and Eric Tam from our office listening in, I believe, in a different location. And then also the owners of Dorothea and Kevin Katz. So again, this is a study session. We're here to gather your feedback before we make a formal application. And so we're going to walk you through our thinking so far and our design so far. So let me see, we do have a...
Yeah, I will do a quick share screen and bring up the presentation. Okay. And Isaiah, you can let me know when to advance the slides.
Okay. And does it go a little more full screen for you, or okay?
This is the best I can do.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. The site is in a great location. It's a half block from groceries and services, a quarter-mile to BART, shares a fence with the Ohlone Greenway Park. And next slide. As was mentioned earlier, could we go to the slide 2? As was mentioned earlier, it has been identified as a housing opportunity site in the general plan. But as we began to look and study the site, we found out that there are, some reasons why the site has remained vacant for so long, and why such a large amount of vacant land at such a great site has remained vacant. And the site is definitely unusually long and narrow. Next slide. And just for a sense of scale, the diagram at the top there shows that a standard parking space would actually need to back up 8'6" onto the neighbor's property in order to get any kind of efficient, normal, perpendicular parking like you would have in the apartment buildings just to the north on the wider sites. And on the lower diagram there, that shows if you try to run the parking in the opposite direction, by the time you factor in the setbacks and columns, you really can only get 4 spaces. So our proposal to get the 6 mostly conforming spaces is the most parking that we were able to get onto the site. Next slide. Now it is technically possible, to do a big underground automated system where you drive up and a robot elevator takes your car down into a pit. But these types of systems are astronomically expensive, especially on a tight, narrow site like this. This would require underpinning of all the neighbors, and it's just not at all economically feasible. And next slide. So with the open space, if we didn't have surface parking, as our optimal solution, really the only feasible solution, there might be more ground level space for open space, but fortuitously, the site does share a fence with the open space of the Ohlone Greenway. We did also look at trying to put a rooftop open space deck, but that also becomes extremely expensive because that space would then trigger the requirement for an elevator in the building, and also 2 stairs running up higher. Between the elevator overruns and the stairs, it would effectively make the building about 10 feet taller and add a huge amount of cost for something that's really sort of intended to be affordable by design, as proposed. Next slide. Similarly, we did think about potentially demolishing the front fourplex, but really when we looked at it, it would cost roughly $350,000 to build, to rebuild each one of those units. And at the end of the day, the project wouldn't have any additional units in it. It would just cost $1.4 million extra to build. And so we very quickly made the decision that that there's a lot of value in that existing building. So just to summarize, we have a great location, but some challenges, because of the tight site. We realized that the state density bonus is really set up to address exactly this type of situation during the housing crisis, where it allows flexibility for housing to be built on locations like this, where it would not otherwise be possible due to the site constraints. So in this case, the law, provides the two incentives or concessions to modify those standards for parking and open space that save the project money and really make the project feasible. Next slide. And so, so we very early on asked ourselves, two key questions. In this housing crisis, should we still build housing for people on a site where it's not feasible to house as many cars? Does it still make sense to build housing for 14 households, even though we can't house 14 cars? And then the second question, in terms of renting it at the end of the day, once it's built, are there at least 14 households in the East Bay that are car-free and would be happy to live in the proposed project, which is close to BART, public transit, bike trails, walking distance to groceries and services, and is located in a city with excellent public schools? And we believe that the answer is emphatically yes. So next slide, we'll just go quickly through the drawings, which you've probably all seen. The first page here is a view up the driveway towards the new building, where we've really tried to highlight an entry piece there. Moving on to the next slide, just project context. Again, the very narrow lot. Next slide is just project data, and we're happy to answer any questions at all about that. Yeah, so we could advance that one. And this page is the A0.3 is a comparison of the sort of a non-density bonus project where money is no issue. It is, if money aside, it is feasible to park underground. So on the left is a project which does not add any additional density and is not really a very financially, it's probably not a project that would ever get built, but that is the hypothetical base project, and on the right is the proposed project. Next slide. Just a zoning summary again. Next slide, site survey. And then A2.1 is the plan. So we'll walk you through the plans. So a question came up about the ADA parking. The front building actually, all of the units have stairs and stoops up into them. So none of those units are accessible currently. So the new accessible spot would be for the new building, and the four other spaces would be for the existing building. So just to walk you through, enter along the existing driveway, lobby at the front, which is kind of set back and has kind of highlight material. We've got lobby and mail, a bike room. As you move further back in the building, there are 2 units on the ground level. And moving up in the building, the units stack all the way up. There are 2 stairs with adequate separation. Towards the middle are 1-bedroom units, and then on either end, facing east and west, are 2-bedroom units. In terms of where the affordable units would be located, we've not talked about that yet, but really the law requires that they be sort of evenly distributed and of an even size. So we'll include that with a formal application, but that would be our intention, is that that those units are every bit as nice as the units on the whole and spread out. Next slide. Here's elevations, which Jean did a great job of describing. Again, we're very early in the design process, here to get feedback and welcome your feedback on these. It's currently proposed as a mix of stucco and horizontal siding, aluminum windows, and next, please. And there's a view, the same view up along the driveway with the lobby in the back. Next slide. A view from the corner of Evelyn and Brighton. And next slide. And finally, a view looking back towards the northwest. And final slide is just an aerial in the context there. So that's our presentation at this stage. And again, very early in the process, and we look forward to hearing your feedback.
Great, thank you. Do commissioners have any questions of the project applicant before we open it up for public comment? No questions?
Yeah, I'll ask a question on my mind. I hadn't really looked at the entire project site and as a whole, the existing units plus the proposed new ones. But as Isaiah is talking and as we go through it, I'm wondering if there's been any thought in using the building that's on the site that's 60 years old now, and making that into entirely affordable housing, 4 units instead of 2, and because it would be well depreciated and wouldn't have the construction capital requirements of the new construction, and then maybe we could get 4 affordable units by converting that building making that building affordable, and then not having to spend the capital of new construction to create the proposed 2 new affordable units in the new building. It's just a thought I had. I don't know. There probably are some legalistic problems about that, but I'm just wanted to just thinking out loud, really.
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept. So I think we can follow up. You know, our project team can follow up with the city and follow up with the owners if that could make some sense. Certainly, a creative solution that's a very interesting idea.
Commissioner McLeod?
Yeah, I had a question mostly about your interior circulation. Partly it's the stairs you're proposing, they just look like enclosed fire stairs. No windows, no external view ports or windows or any kind of, what I would consider visual relief from the interior. Is that true?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We could certainly look at adding windows to them. We'll take note of that. That would make some sense. I mean, the experience of going up and down the stair would be much nicer with some windows. So that's a good point.
I also had a question for you all. In looking at this, so one of the waivers that you guys are seeking is a height waiver. And I'm just wondering if you looked at, since you're already requesting a parking waiver or a parking incentive to reduce the amount of parking, if you thought at all about reducing the parking to 0 and utilizing that area on the lot to reallocate some of the height and sort of stack a 3-story volume in that space instead of having the parking there.
Well, I would say, and just because it was brought up earlier too, that, we have several projects in Berkeley that were approved with concessions all the way down to 0 parking. So that is something that we have, encountered before. That said, those are mostly right in the real downtown of Berkeley, and that's certainly something we'll talk about after the meeting. If there was generally support for that, from the council, that's certainly something that we could look at. I know that the project team, the owners, do have some concern about going too low on the parking side, just in terms of the leasing. But it's certainly, we'd love to get an opinion on whether or not that's something that you would support as a group, and that would help us know if we should even consider it. Haven't looked to see if we could take the whole thing down to 3 stories by doing that, but it's an interesting concept. So yeah, again, we'd love to hear from others on the commission if that's something that's supportable or preferable, as a kind of either or.
Okay, great. I'm sure there'll be folks with opinions when we get to sort of the commissioner comment section. Before we turn it over to public comment, are there any other questions? All right, seeing no questions, if we can open it up for public comment, please.
Yes, we have the first speaker, Stephen Edrington. You may now speak, Stephen.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Steve Edrington with Edrington and Associates. We're consultants, and we're out of Oakland, and we represent Lee Pruneau, which is the project's too big for the site, and that's the issue that we're having. And we concerned about open space, and currently, if you look at the data, they would need about 3,600 square feet of open space, and the credit that they're seeking would give them about 200 or 3,400. Basically, they're going down to 0 to 500. There's just not enough open space, and they're basically using the greenbelt and adopting that as their open space, and we think that's a poorly planned proposal. Secondly, parking. Parking's an issue in the neighborhood. If you look at the half space per unit that they're proposing, it actually have a -1 parking space on the ratio. So what happens is 14 parking spots get pushed into the neighborhood and cause congestion in the neighborhood. So when you look at that, this impacts the neighborhood by pushing 14 potential vehicles in front of the neighbors' houses and creates more congestion. The other thing they're proposing is a height. The current height limit there is 35 feet. They're proposing 45. It's just too big. And it's a really skinny lot, and it needs to have a smaller building on that lot. The other issue, the third issue that I want to raise is there are several large trees. In reality, they would have to remove several of the trees to make it work, or severely trim them, which may permanently damage the trees. So there's a tree problem with this site, and this building is encroaching on the current trees. We calculated, based on the housing element of the general plan, 11 units, and if you added a 35% bonus, it'd be 14.8, not 18. So we're a little concerned about. I know you went through the math, but it's still, the math isn't that clear. The final comment that I want to make is looking at the front of the old building and the driveway. It looks like there is a potential fire problem. I don't know if there's that lot is really deep, and if you have a fire in that back building, how do you get your fire engine from through that lot and put out the fire? So that's a very narrow driveway there, and it's a potential fire hazard as well. We think this is a poorly proposed idea. We think the building needs to be shrunk down. It's a weird lot, and they're proposing too big of a building on that lot. So we encourage the council, the commissions, to say no to this project and drastically scale it back. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Yes, next speaker is John Erminger. John, you can now speak.
Okay. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is John Erminger, and I've been a resident of 1247 Brighton for the past 14 years. So 1247 is the apartment that abuts right next to the construction site. So in general, it's illusory to think that high density housing with a small percent of below market units will decrease the demand pressure on housing supply. Of the 14 proposed units, 12 will be market rate. Most of the housing is for high end. Furthermore, to qualify for the below market rate, you generally have to be very poor. For the vast majority of people struggling paycheck to paycheck, these units aren't going to do anything. In fact, the most direct route to meeting the housing shortage would be to bring to market the almost 50,000 already existing vacant units. That's from a San Jose Mercury article this January. In the 5 counties, there's a lot of vacant space. Building more luxury housing, expecting to make things more affordable is trickle-down housing, and it works about as well as trickle-down economics. In the particular case of this 14-unit plan, the general issues are compounded by issues that relate to this particular site. Traffic has gotten much more congested in this area since the apartments on the south side of El Cerrito Plaza were built, and cars now fill up both sides of the block of Evelyn north of Brighton day and night, and the El Cerrito Plaza parking lot is full all day. There's only a very narrow driveway, barely wide enough for a small compact car into the access area. And as the previous speaker pointed out, fire is going to be an issue. I'd just like to add one other element, and that is the second floor balcony projects out. So you couldn't bring a fire truck there. It's not just the width of the alleyway that's a limiting factor. The balcony on the existing 4-unit building is blocking as well. So I would say the description of the project gives me a sense that it's going to create an increasing sense of claustrophobia in the neighborhood. I mean, I've been here for 14 years and things are going up and up and up, you know, especially to the north side there. And so I would say its building would be a significant decrease in the life quality for the existing residents. Views are blocked, and amongst other things, and also the issues the other speaker mentioned. Thank you very much.
We have one more speaker, Aaron Tiederman. Aaron, you can now speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So I am a longtime resident of Albany, and I also work in affordable housing for the county. So I've heard a lot of these sorts of conversations about infill development and affordable housing development. And I think this project is, by really all the measures that are usually talked about in these conversations, a pretty good design. Just to first address something about need, we need over 1 million housing units in the Bay Area. You know, using what's vacant now isn't going to solve that. We have to develop not just large projects like Albany is looking to develop the affordable housing development down by the freeway. We have to start looking at projects like this that develop smaller amounts of housing, you know, 10, 14, 18 units in largely single family areas. But this project especially, I think, really seems well designed in that this is an area that's not, it's not a street of single family homes or anything like that. This is next to several large apartment buildings. There's not, I think, a huge amount of worry about open space because, as they said, as the designer said, it's right next to the Ohlone Greenway, which is a huge amount of open space. It's the worry about cars, I think, is not very justified, as it's steps away from a major transit center with the BART station. And I think these are the kinds of things we have to consider when we're making housing. Is, what type of neighborhood is it in? Where is it near amenities? Is it near transportation if we're limiting parking? And this so clearly is near these amenities that it needs, given that it doesn't have a ton of open space, given that it doesn't have parking. And then I think on the height, it's smart use of a difficult lot. It's putting the maximum amount of units to make it feasible, to put in affordable units, to use that lot effectively. And then lastly, on the point of that these are luxury units, I think that the designers mentioned that these are affordable by design. These are, small, moderate income units, it seems like. So I don't think there's a lot of credence to saying that these are not going to benefit anyone. Thank you.
I don't see any other speakers with their hands raised at this moment.
All right, we'll give it one last call. Again, any attendees who have called in, if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand now through Zoom. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and close public comment. All right, seeing no raised hands, we'll go ahead and close public comment and we'll turn it back to the commissioners for discussion. Do any commissioners have any initial comments? Sure, Commissioner Jennings.
Sure, I'm happy to start if that's okay. So I'll say that, in general, I'm supportive of the density. I do think this is, if we're going to be looking at locations to put high density housing with limited parking, it should be, in close proximity to transit, like the BART station and other amenities. This is, there's a fair amount of unused or underutilized space on this site. I think overall what we're seeing is a creative use of that pretty challenging site to develop. I do think the devil's in the details. And so, a few things that I think would be good for the project proponent to think about and for staff to help address as this moves forward is, it strikes me right off the bat that there are a lot of existing nonconformities on the site. So this isn't like a brand new build where we're just looking at, a few waivers. We're also in this context where they're already not meeting setbacks and open space requirements, etc. And I think especially given that the degree of nonconformities, I would really like to see the project sponsor try to do everything they can to avoid the need for additional waivers. So, for example, the height waiver might be necessary to achieve the density that it takes to make this work, but do we really need to have a waiver for the rear setback? I don't know. I think I'd like to, I just would encourage some, thoughtful consideration of the number of waivers that you're asking for in light of the existing conditions on the site, and making sure to really justify that, you wouldn't be able to build the project without those waivers. So that's one consideration. In terms of the nonconformities, I did have the question that one of the commenters brought up about fire and emergency vehicle access, just because it looks like a really narrow driveway. And if we're going to be putting more units back there, it does seem like that's something that it may not actually be an issue. But, I think we need to hear some analysis about that and make sure that the fire department doesn't have concerns about it. With respect to the parking question, you know, in general, I'm fine with thoughtful parking reductions. And again, I think if you're going to have a parking reduction or you know, almost elimination of parking, this is probably the location to do it. It does seem quite the parking that would be available for the 18 units. So really one parking space for every 3 units does seem quite low to me. And I would like to, again, hear some more about kind of comparable precedents that we might be looking at, not, you know, in downtown San Francisco necessarily, but other projects in Berkeley and El Cerrito, you know, Oakland even, that that have looked at achieving a similar parking ratio, because it seems quite low even for a density bonus project. And I believe the state law has provision. I know there are parking provisions under the state density bonus law about the maximum amounts that cities can require, but I think this is well below what would otherwise be required even under what the city would be allowed to require even under the density bonus law. So again, I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but would I think we really need to think it through and need to have the project sponsor make the case that it's not going to cause problems in the neighborhood and that it's going to work here. I would also just encourage you to think about some kind of architectural integration with the remaining front building, even if it's something superficial. I mean, frankly, even if it's paint, like, I don't know, just something that ties the old and the new together, I think will be really beneficial from a design perspective. And I would like I liked Doug's comment suggesting that, you know, you think about whether it's possible to actually utilize the existing building as a 4-unit affordable project, even if that doesn't end up working out, you know, just with the degree of waivers and concessions that are being requested here. I know that, you know, the city has limited discretion around those issues, but it does seem like it would be an easier case to make if we were talking about 2 very low income units, or, you know, say 3 units total, like a very low income, a low income, and a moderate unit, something that provides a greater degree of, or really one more affordable unit. So again, just something to think about in coming back. So I think those are all of my comments for now. Again, in general, I'm supportive of the density in this location, but just want to make sure that we're thinking through all these details.
Yes, Commissioner Donaldson.
Okay. Let's see some general comments to start out with. It's interesting to see this site being developed. I remember it when we did the housing element, and when at that time I looked at this site and I said, "Whoa, that's never gonna be developed." It's such a difficult site, and to have that small vacant lot back there on a very narrow lot. So I'm pleased to see that we have a proposal to do something here. I'm also pleased that we have Trachtenberg working on the project, because this firm I know has done some really good work, and I have confidence in their ability to do a really good project and have a project that looks good when it comes out. And they've done other projects in Albany that have worked out really well, and other cities around here, certainly in Berkeley. So I have a lot of confidence just because we're working, the applicant is working with this architect. That's encouraging for me. generally, I think I'm okay with the density bonus proposal and the components of that. I don't think I have a problem with the height going up to 45 feet. I'm not terribly bothered by that. We have other buildings in town. I think that being the back of the site, I think it'll be okay here. Would work out okay. My biggest concerns, and they might be serious concerns in a couple of cases, are with the two concessions. Concession number one is the parking. I have been going out recently, last few days since we got the application, looking at the parking in the morning along Evelyn, and what I see is a street that is completely parked up. One space maybe is not used during the night, and we have the new development down in El Cerrito Plaza, and they must have unbundled parking because they have spaces vacant in their garage, but they're taking up, but it looks like that project is taking up 3 rows of parking in El Cerrito Plaza. So I'm worried about the idea that people are proposing that that we can get rid of parking because we're so close to transit and because people will walk and people will bike. We're still in that transition away from that, and everybody, people own cars, people want cars, they use their cars. I seriously doubt that this project would have 14 units of housing, or let's say 12 units of housing that didn't have cars. I don't know how many cars it would generate. I don't think it would generate a full demand of 1 space per unit. But I don't know where it would be, and I don't know if anyone. I'd really like to have some confidence that this will generate fewer than 1 cars per unit in the real world situation. Not only is that street really parked up, but school's not in session, and they're right next to the middle school. And the middle school has gotten rid of their teacher parking lot. They now have portables on it. So for hundreds of feet around, 500 feet, maybe more, you have teacher parking scattered all through the neighborhood when school's in session. That's a real practical concern for me. So I don't know where I'm going to vote or where I would vote on that parking concession. To me, it's a real tough one. And if I had some assurance that indeed we're going to have a real transit-oriented development here where people will use their bikes and they'll walk to BART and they'll walk to the shopping, then it'd be great. But we don't have a way of guaranteeing that. And maybe that'll be true with this kind of project 10 years from now. But in the interim, I'm worried about the increased parking demand. And I suspect that even optimistically, this project would generate 4 or 5 more cars parked on the street. And I don't know, can we handle that? Can the street handle that or not? Maybe, but it's a real tough one for me. The other concession is the open space concession. I have concerns about that one too, a little less, I guess. But when zoning was first invented, 1910, 100 years ago, roughly. One of the reasons it came about was because of tenement buildings in big cities, New York, et cetera, that didn't have access to light, air, and open space. They probably may not even have windows, but open space and access to light, air, and open space is sort of fundamental from a planning perspective for construction. So it raises a red flag to me when we're looking at a building that won't have private open space. It might work here with the access to BART and to the greenway, that may in fact work actually as a kind of a front yard for the people who live in the site, a place to go out and stretch, a place to get fresh air. It may work that way. In fact, that grass of that section of the Ohlone Greenway is pretty wide and isn't used very much, I guess, except during middle school hours. Anyway, that raises a red flag for me, and I wish it weren't so. I wish that every unit had at least 100 square feet, at least a balcony or a 10 by 10 balcony, 100 square feet of open space somehow. So those are my concerns. Those are my comments at this time.
Any other commissioners have any comments?
I could speak.
Sure, Commissioner Kent.
Three things jumped out of me that I speak to probably. First of all, the trees, I think they could probably be saved in this construction, and I think it would be important to do so because they do a lot to screen the building and add privacy to the residents on Brighton. But I think with a little sensitivity, they probably could be saved. So I'm not too worried about that. The entry was very awkward to me. Aside from the fire access, it just seemed a real back of house. There's no presence on the street to that 14 units that are stuck in the back. Usually when you have units in the back, it's almost you squeeze through in a garden setting, but in this case you squeeze through and it's a really dense setting. It's kind of an awkward place. And I don't know if it's really been resolved. It still feels like a driveway entry that possibly could be enhanced architecturally somehow. So that's potential. But the biggest issue, and it's already been, Doug mentioned it, and a few others have too, is the open space. I don't think the greenway will work for an open space for this building. It won't work for the kids. You're not going to let your 5-year-old out there to play and not be around, or 10-year-old. If you go out to the greenway, the parents have to be with them, unless they're older. So it doesn't really work as a private open space. It's kind of a trail. It's not a place you can hang out and sit around in a chair and have a little snack or a drink with your friends, as you might expect with private open space, or even quasi or semi-private open space that's shared with the tenants. So that bothers me. They're all very tight spaces with no place to go. And we look at COVID now, where everybody needs a little bit of open space, and that would be a really difficult place to have kids. And it was presented as, Albany has great schools and where you might want to have children here, and it doesn't work in that way unless you have a little bit of space for them to be outside and still be close. It's possible that maybe there's a deck that can go over part of the parking, and that could be the open space. But I think I'm not quite sure if the code means it all has to be accessible or not. It has to be a 1-story elevator to get to that, so the tenants on the bottom floor can share that open space. I'm not sure how that works. But if there's a way that maybe we lose a unit or be reconfigured so that there is more community open space, I think the project would be a lot better. Right now, it's just way too dense, not enough space. It squeezes in there. It looks like it would be rented out, I'm sure, but as soon as better options came, people would leave. I don't think it would be a desirable place to live. People would live there because they don't have options. And I think if anyone were to do a good job, and I agree with Doug, I think Trachtenberg Architects would do. I've seen their projects in Berkeley, and they do some great work. But still, I think this is too much on the site. So I think it's kind of a difficult project. And the way it is now, I wouldn't really support it. That's it.
Commissioner McLeod, did you have comments?
Well, hold on, there, I'm muted. Yeah, I have quite a few thoughts about this. And just to clarify, if this project does qualify for the state density bonus, then the concessions we don't have the ability to disapprove them, or, it's not like we approve or disapprove them. They would just be granted, right, as right if it qualifies for the state density bonus. So I just wanted to clarify that. I have a lot of thoughts about high density. I think in terms of this site, I think it is an excellent site for that. In terms of adjacencies to BART, bus stops, the bike trail, shops. If there is a place that it could be a truly transit-oriented development, I think this is it. So, in most ways, I support the parking reduction. I think it's a good thing. I think the trade-off between parking spaces and units is a real fundamental one that, like the planner, Gene Eisenberg, said it at our last meeting in terms of the San Pablo specific plan, that rents subsidize parking spaces. So if you take away parking spaces, the rents don't have to subsidize it, and you're making your project more affordable. You're keeping rents lower. So I think that's an excellent trade-off. And it's also a spatial trade-off in that you're trading parking space, you're getting rid of parking spaces and you're getting more units. I think that's the whole point of the state density bonus law, is to apply to situations like this. So getting rid of parking spaces and getting more units is absolutely an appropriate use of the state density bonus law, and especially on a site where we may not have a building otherwise. So if it's a choice between the two concessions and not having a building, I'm happy to have those concessions, quite frankly. We have a housing crisis, like one speaker mentioned. We're 1 million units short in California. It is a crisis. I really do support this project. I think it's an excellent use of the site. I had a lot of thoughts about, other uses. If we're going to make a transit-oriented development, then I think the project applicant and developer should really be pushing the bike rooms. I don't think it should be the minimum requirement. I think it should be making it accessible for cargo bikes. Electric bike charging stations have some kind of bike repair room facility. The bikes outside worry me a little bit unless they're in enclosures. That's going to be a big target for theft right along the Greenway. We have ride share, we have scooter e-shares. There are a lot of things coming along that mean people will need cars less in the future. More people are working at home, as we all see, as we're all doing right now. That's probably going to continue, so there may be less need for commuting. I see electric bikes as a great way of people getting around the town and cities. And the more this project can accommodate cargo bikes, give people a real alternative to their cars, then you're making a more convincing case for reducing the parking. As far as, let's see, I had some other notes here. I think there's some other considerations. I would like to see this project go all electric. We have a climate action plan that calls for greenhouse gas reductions of 70% in 10 years and eliminating greenhouse gas by 2045. So going all electric now moves us along in that direction. I do have concerns about the open space. I think it's unfortunate that you couldn't provide balconies or some sort of open areas for each unit, at least some place to step out and have a little breathing room. I think that's possible. I think the roof, I see the point about not making the roof into an open space area. I know that's very expensive. And I think you should be putting solar panels as much as possible on that roof, and that should become part of your project. It can be a little higher construction cost, maybe a little higher rent, but in exchange for lower utility bills for all your residents. I think that's a worthy trade-off and gets us also further along in our climate action goals. As far as the architecture, I have some really major concerns about your entry sequence and pathway and the experience of going up into those units. The lobby looks great, looks nice, but once you get out of that lobby and you get into your stairwell, you are in what, a 4-story dark stairwell, no relief. The experience of going up that every day, up to the top, and then you get into the corridors on the other side, on the north side. I got to say that whole passageway experience looks really grim to me, and I know you can do a better job. I know they will do a better job. The hallways on the north side basically have 4 slit windows, 3 or 4 slit windows. I think that's going to be a really grim experience. I don't see why those can't be like open breezeways, also open to the air, something like that. You know, that elevation on the north side needs help. It's just looking like very tiny little punched openings. You know, I think you could do a much better job there. And of course, the whole building will get more articulated and have more visual interest as you go along, I'm sure, which balconies could help. I have no problem with the height of the building. It seems appropriate for that neighborhood. And some of the one letter that we got that said the cost reductions lead to a bigger building with more units. Well, that's entirely the point of the state density bonus law. So doesn't seem like that's an argument that's valid against this kind of construction or this unit, this project. Anything else? Let's see. You know, I'm not really sure they could do the 4 units affordable on the front and not have an affordable unit in the back. Then it wouldn't qualify for the state density bonus law potentially. So I'm not sure how that would work out. That would lead to a completely different project, I suppose. So, you know, that would be up to the applicant to look at, but I think it might not work overall in the big picture. So finally, I support this project 100%. I think it's a great use of the site. I think it's really a good potential transit-oriented development, walking distance to everything anybody would need, you know, and I support it. So thanks.
Great, thanks. I'll just jump in with a few additional comments. I too am very supportive of this project. I think it is a great location for a high density apartment building utilizing state density bonus. I'm excited to see a lot that I think no one anticipated would actually ever be built get used, and let alone get used with state density bonus. So I think this is an exciting project in general. Obviously, a lot of details still to be worked out. I would say the first ask that I would have, and not to say that this is where I would want the project to go, but I do think it would be helpful from understanding the height waiver perspective to see a reallocation of that square footage in the area that's currently proposed for the surface parking in between the buildings, just to understand what the trade-offs are there. Obviously, there may be issues with adequate light and ventilation into units. There might be, you know, reduction to the front buildings, light and open space. But it would be helpful to understand sort of that square footage and that massing, and if it could be reallocated in any other way, and what sort of the pros and cons would be, just so that we have that information when we're making our decision and understanding the height waiver. That would be helpful for me. Similarly, shifting of the building to accommodate a code compliant rear yard would also be helpful to kind of understand what does that do on the site and what type of spaces does that create. I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the right solution, but I think just, again, having those scenarios drawn out would be really helpful. With that said, my primary concern about the project is actually with the parking in the middle. In terms of the residential entry, I do have some concerns about sort of safety conflicts with the fact that it's a pretty narrow ingress. And, you know, I can just see at night, if you're walking home and you're walking off of Evelyn and there are cars coming out, it's a pretty tight space. And for me at least, if we're having parking incentives and there's going to be a parking reduction anyhow, I would personally be supportive of a no parking project here and leveraging that space for a really well-designed open space, similar to what Commissioner Kent was talking about the sort of garden setting of having a building tucked at the rear of a lot. I kind of feel like right now it's like halfway in between, where it's it's cited in that way, but it's not designed in that way in terms of open space. And so I would be supportive of having that be a purely residential entry, designed with, permeable paving, the right kind of residential pathway, really a usable open space, like sort of a common usable open space in that middle area without the parking. And then also maybe looking at ways to leverage balconies, either projecting over that at the front or at the rear, and introducing a bit more usable open space, even if it's not to the fully code compliant required amount, really looking to see if there are ways to leverage and increase the residential usable open space on this project. For me, the parking issue, and I know there's not, entirely in agreement on the commission on this, but from my perspective, you can't get any more transit-oriented development in Albany than this location. So if there's anywhere to do it in Albany, this is where it's to be done. And I also just kind of feel that there are different housing typologies. And if this building is built without off-street parking, at some level, the market will dictate, and people will either know that they're going to have to circle the block and they might have to park a few blocks away. And as somebody who lived in San Francisco for many years and sometimes had to circle the block for a long time, those decisions start factoring into where you choose to live and when you choose to own cars and when you choose to use those cars versus take transit or ride bikes. And I also feel, there are a lot of people in Albany. I grew up in Albany, and I'll tell you, I don't know one person who actually parked in their garage. And so I feel like single family home garage spaces were basically just a way to privatize a curb cut and basically privatize street parking. And so my feeling is if the street parking is taken up, it's public property, and that's what it's there for. And so I am perfectly supportive of having this project increase the square footage of this lot for residential uses and for residential open space uses and not for parking. And I think this is a project that we can test that out on. Not every project that we see is the right candidate to do that, but I do think that this one would be. And I think that would make it a better project. So that's my primary focus on this, is really making that space between the two buildings a more quality space and making it really a more prominent and, to me, a safer residential sort of pedestrian entry off of Evelyn. Obviously, the architecture is not fleshed out. I think there's a lot of balancing to do between sort of privacy impacts on the two adjacent buildings to the north and to the south, and being sensitive about not having, large windows peering into either the apartment building to the north or to the residential backyards, and sort of balancing that. But I think that is something that can be worked on. But those are my general thoughts to that point. I do think, though, if this is going to be a no parking project, there does have to be extra attention to bike parking and making sure that there's, adequate enclosed and safe parking for cargo bikes and things of that nature. So the people who choose to live here truly can be folks who have chosen to have more of a car-free lifestyle moving in. And again, this isn't huge numbers, but I think overall, I think this is a good project, and I'm excited to see it move forward. Any other, we've got a couple of follow-up comments. So we'll start with Commissioner Donaldson and then Commissioner McLeod.
Thank you, commissioners. I'm impressed with the comments we've heard. I had a couple of notes that I made, and two things I want to mention. First of all, I want to second Commissioner Jennings' comment about integrating design qualities between the existing front building and the new project. I think that was a great comment. I want to second that. And also, Commissioner McLeod was talking about the bike parking, and when he was talking, it did occur to me that the bike area really should have make sure we have access for chargers for electric bikes, because it does occur to me that this is the kind of project that probably would have people using electric bikes, maybe even in lieu of automobiles. So those are my comments now. Mm-hmm.
Commissioner McLeod?
Yeah, I just want to bring up one more point. I do appreciate Commissioner Waddy's ideas about no parking, and it is kind of an interesting, or it would be difficult. The driveway is pedestrian access also. I think that is kind of something that the designers, developers have to figure out how to make sure that's safe. And if car parking was eliminated, that would solve that problem and could could mean it could be a great open space area in the middle, kind of a big courtyard, European style courtyard that's meant for people to inhabit and be in. Kids could play in it. It could be a very, very attractive project. My last thought is just about the idea of not putting an elevator in the building, because a lot of seniors have the idea, I'm going to retire, I want a place where I don't need a car. This could be that kind of place. But if you don't have an elevator, I think it makes it a lot more difficult to think they're going to live on, maybe anywhere but the bottom floor or second floor. And I think it just makes life a lot easier, and it makes the project just much more inclusionary for all types of people, anybody with mobility issues, or even, let's say you need, even if you're sick for a little while and you need a wheelchair or something just to get in and out of this building would be awfully tough without an elevator. It could make it much more accessible to all kinds of users. So I think that's something to think about for the project architects and developer.
Are there any other commissioner comments? It does look like the project sponsor has their hand raised and has a final response. So maybe we'll, or did their hand went away? Oh, no, okay. Why don't we turn it over to the project applicant for a quick response to some of our questions.
Isaiah, you can now speak.
Okay. I think in general, just want to thank you all for a lot of great ideas. And, I think that our team will get together tomorrow morning and talk about them all and look at implement them. I think great feedback and some really interesting concepts, both sort of large scale and small, that will give us a lot to work with. I don't recall any specific questions that folks had, but if we're overlooking some specific questions, certainly happy to to answer them all to the best we can at this early stage. But otherwise, I think our team feels like we got great feedback here, and thank you very much for that. And I think that's kind of it at the moment.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it doesn't look like we have any additional comments for you. So thank you. All right, commissioners, we will move on to, then we will close this item and we will move on to item 7 on our agenda, new business, item 7-1, which is a study session of green building updates.
Good evening, commissioners. This is Jeff Baum, the Community Development Director. I will briefly introduce the staff report and then turn it over. But I want to introduce to you Michelle Klaus. Michelle is a intern in our office for the last number of months, probably 6-7 months now, I think. She's a graduate at UC Santa Cruz and has been working on a variety of things, and most particularly recently has gone deep into the world of green building standards and has done a lot of research on what other communities are doing, and also has done made some presentations and worked with our Climate Action Committee and their subcommittee that's been focused on this over the last few months. So I'd like to turn it over to Michelle, and then when she's done with her presentation, I'll address a couple of issues that have come up that we would just like to flag to the Commission's attention. But at this point, I'll let Michelle introduce to you the work that she's done with the Climate Action Committee and their recommendations.
Thanks, Jeff. Let me bring this up really quickly. Can everyone hear me and see my screen okay? Yeah. Yes. Well, yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle. And And like Jeff said, I've been working with the Climate Action Committee and specifically the Green Building Subcommittee to put together this proposal of green building requirements, new added requirements. And so I'm just going to kind of go over background initially on Cal Green and the voluntary tiers that we got most of these new proposed requirements from. Kind of talk through how that works, and then I'm going to go over the group of proposed requirements. First, talking about measures related to energy efficiency, which are the kind of the most complicated ones, and then all of the other measures after that. And that's going to be related to both residential and non-residential buildings, and within residential, single family and multifamily as well. So a lot that's going to be covered here. And then finally, I'll talk about the next steps and kind of what the plan is going forward. So Cal Green is our statewide green building code. And there are 3 levels. The bottom level here, mandatory, is what all buildings in the state have to follow. And then there are these voluntary tiers, tier 1 and tier 2, that are basically a set of kind of more advanced green measures that either individual buildings can choose to use or cities can require. So a city could require all of tier 1 or all of tier 2, which would be the highest level, or take pieces from each of those, which is what the Green Building Subcommittee did here. So it's kind of a mishmash of different measures that we thought would work best for Albany. And those measures are divided into these 5 categories here: energy efficiency, which we're going to talk about first, planning and design, water efficiency, materials conservation, and then environmental quality. So we have some related to each of those. So to dig into the energy efficiency first, I'll talk about the California Energy Commission, which is a really important piece of this. The California Energy Commission gets to set the energy efficiency standards that are in the mandatory Cal Green tier. And cities can adopt stricter requirements, but they have to be approved by the Energy Commission first. And the Energy Commission basically creates a series of case studies that determine what energy efficiency standards are cost effective. So it makes sure that cities aren't requiring any standards that are just, way out of proportion with the costs and would make the housing crisis and other issues worse. So all of our proposals are based on what the Energy Commission would accept and allow us to implement. Okay, a little bit more detail here. This is the energy design rating scale, and this is how residential buildings, how their energy efficiency is measured. This is a new tool from the 2019 Cal Green Code. And the way it works is that every building is rated on a scale from 100 to 0. And 100 would be a 2006 IECC compliant home. That's sort of the baseline. And then 0 is a net zero energy home. And so every building will fall somewhere in that category on one of these numbers. The mandatory Cal Green Code has a set requirement for each building type, and that's based on, it's based on type and then also size, whether it's gas, mixed fuel, or electric, variety of things like that. And so essentially what the proposal would do would push that requirement down so that the buildings have to be even more energy efficient. They have to have a lower EDR. Okay. And the way that we refer to that is through this term here, EDR margin, right there. So this example that I have written on the slide here, this would be a kind of standard multifamily building in Albany. So that's the mandatory requirement. It would have to be 23.9. And then our proposal would push that down to 13.9. And so it would be an EDR margin of 10, just the difference between 23.9 and 13.9. So that's just to explain the numbers you're about to see on the next slide here. I know it's a little complicated, so I'm happy to answer questions about that afterwards. So let me just go down to the next slide and show you what those EDR margins are that we're talking about. So for a single family building that's mixed fuel, we would propose an EDR margin of 10. For an electric building, a margin of 4.7. For multifamily, 10.3. For mixed fuel with 10.3, and then for multifamily electric, it'd be 0. So that's no difference. It's the same as the mandatory. And in this next column here, we have the cost, the added cost of that increased energy requirement. So this is our estimate for those things. And then also the estimate for the CO2 reduction from those added requirements. And just to kind of explain this a little bit, basically what this would require is that for all of these types of buildings, you'd have to have the building envelope itself be more efficient with things like better insulation, thicker windows, that sort of thing. And then also for the mixed fuel buildings, you would need more solar panels and also a solar storage battery. So that's where this added cost is coming from. And you'll note for the single family electric building, there's this thing called the efficiency margin. And all that means is that it would only be requiring the building itself to be, more insulated and that sort of thing. There'd be no added solar panels or solar storage batteries of any kind. And that's why the added cost is quite low. And the reasoning behind that, before I go on to the next one, the reasoning behind that is really meant to incentivize new construction to be all electric. That's a big part of our climate action goals. And because we have such clean electricity from EBCE, the idea is the more we can electrify our building stock, the more we can reduce our overall greenhouse gas emissions. And so rather than outright banning gas, which might happen at some point in the future, but has legal issues at the moment, we decided to go for this approach, which basically just makes it so that building an electric building is much cheaper. And it allows you to create that incentive pretty easily, just using these different numbers. And now for non-residential, it's a really similar type of thing, but a slightly different terminology. So compliance margins are the way that you measure energy efficiency for these types of buildings. 100% compliance margin would be like a net zero building. 0% is just like a normal mandatory building. So the higher your compliance margin, the more efficient the building. And you can see here, we have for mixed fuel office buildings, 20% compliance margin with a relatively high cost and a relatively high greenhouse gas reduction. And then for the electric ones, again, a lower requirement, only 10% and a lower cost. And then for the retail buildings, they're both at 16%. And you can see for both of them, they have a relatively low added cost and a pretty high greenhouse gas reduction. So we decided to keep those the same. And you might think these numbers look kind of weird, and that's because it's based on that CEC requirement. So for the retail building, the highest the CEC will allow us to go is 16%. And again, here, the focus is really to try to decrease greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, and to create that cost incentive to try to bring people towards building electric. And for those electric buildings to not increase the cost to really an outrageous amount. but to still try to keep the emissions low. And then our final energy efficiency piece is non-residential solar. So according to the new Cal Green 2019 requirements, all residential buildings are required to have solar, but that's not required for non-residential buildings. And this is a proposal that would change that and make it so that solar is also required for non-residential. And the way it would work would be using this thing called the solar zone. So all buildings are required to have a solar zone on their roof, all non-residential buildings. And it has these requirements. So it has to make up at least 15% of the roof area. And it has to be big enough to fit solar panels and not shaded, basically a place where solar panels can eventually be installed. The idea there is to get these buildings ready for solar later down the line. And so what our proposed measure would do is say, okay, you have to use that solar zone and actually install the panels now on that entire solar zone. There's a carve out there for buildings where they might have a huge solar zone that takes up 90% of their building just from the way it's built, and they don't need that many solar panels. So we'll allow them to reduce that just to meet their energy needs, if that's the case. But the general rule would be that they fill that solar zone. So those are all of our, sorry, let me get rid of that circle. So those are all of our energy efficiency measures. And like I said, again, really the reasoning behind all of these is to increase the efficiency of those electric buildings, but not raise the cost a lot. And then for the mixed fuel buildings, we're trying to maximize the efficiency so that either we have really, really efficient mixed fuel buildings or people decide to go for the electric because it's cheaper. And overall, that's going to mean that we have a much greener building stock, and that, you know, we are using this moment when the buildings are being built to make sure that over their whole lifetime, they're reducing their emissions. Okay, so I know that was a lot. We're almost done. We're just going to cover all of the rest of our measures now, which are less complicated. So this is for residential buildings, and these are all of the other kinds of measures that I showed you back at the beginning. And I'll just run through them. So this is kind of the big ticket one at the beginning here, that 20% of multifamily parking spaces would be EV charging stations. And that would go a long way towards moving on our EV action plan and trying to not just electrify the buildings, but also our cars and make our cars greener. But that would only be for new construction. We really wanted to make sure that we wouldn't be causing any sort of safety issues or making it so people aren't renovating a really old parking lot just because they don't want to spend the money on these EV chargers. So it's really just for new construction. But the rest of these measures are basically free. They're very, very low cost. So they're both for new construction and renovation. So it would be requiring one Energy Star washing machine or dishwasher, low flow kitchen faucets, even lower than the current requirement, low carbon concrete, the minimum levels of outdoor lighting so that we're, you know, it's safe still, but we're reducing the amount of power that's used for that lighting. And then also low VOC resilient flooring. So that's just increasing indoor air quality. And then for non-residential buildings, we would have 12% of parking spaces designated for clean air vehicles. And that's just a sign that says, you know, for an EV or for carpools, that sort of thing. It's a reserved space for them. So it's just an incentive. Outdoor lighting power would again be reduced to save energy. 12% reduction in indoor water use. And that can be accomplished in a variety of ways depending on the water fixtures in a specific building. That's also just for new construction, because for renovation, it'd be really difficult to make that work mathematically. And then again, low carbon concrete and low VOC resilient flooring. And this is just to give you a sense of how each of those goals or each of those measures relates to our Albany climate goals and our climate action plan. So some of the main goals from that plan are carbon neutrality, adopting an EV readiness ordinance, using low carbon concrete, water conservation, and improving public health. And you can see that we have measures on each side of these that are aligned specifically with those goals. So again, all of these were chosen because they work for Albany, they make sense for the kinds of buildings that we have, and they kind of give us the greatest bang for our buck. They're not necessarily costing the buildings a ton of money, but they are having a real impact. So as far as next steps, we are bringing this to you so that you can give us all of your feedback, your thoughts on these different measures, any questions you have. And then we're going to bring it back to the Climate Action Committee where they will review it and make a recommendation to council. And if council approves that recommendation, then it will apply to the California Energy Commission for approval, at which point it will be the new requirements for Albany.
I think at this stage, I'll just jump in. Thank you, Michelle. Before Commission gets to questions and comments and discussion, I wanted to acknowledge a couple of things that the Climate Action Committee talked about that as a staff we're continuing to research and look at. One of them is a recommendation from the committee to require upgrades to electric panels when you're replacing a panel. So this would be, if you're replacing a panel, upgrade the capacity of that panel to 200 amps. And the idea behind that is that with a 200 amp panel, you can accommodate an all-electric home, an electric vehicle charger, and not have an infrastructure limitation in order to implement those over time. And one of the things that we've uncovered that we're trying to figure out a little bit more details about is the potential cost of that requirement in some cases. And in particular, if the service line, the PG&E service line from the utility pole to your home cannot accommodate the 200 amp electric flow, then PG&E apparently is charging applicants the cost of replacing those lines. And that can be several $1,000s at least to do that. And in some cases, we've had cases, it was a commercial applicant actually, but PG&E has also required replacement of transformers that the nearby transformer can't serve that. So we want to look into that issue a little bit more. The second issue with the panel upgrades is when the panel is replaced, you're triggering new building code requirements for the placement and spacing of that panel in the on the side of the home or in the front of the home. And unfortunately, sometimes that has design review implications. A lot of our homes in Albany, the panel's kind of tucked around on the side of the house. It's not a big deal, but if you put a larger one in, essentially PG&E is forcing the panel, and the building code is forcing the panel to go on the front of the home, which is aesthetically can be a problem in some cases. And also we know that some people are doing this not, have an immediate need to do this for safety reasons. We still see from time to time homes that have old fuse boxes. They haven't upgraded their electrical since the home was built in the 20s, 30s, or 40s or whatever. So we're looking into that a little bit more. The second issue that was discussed by the Climate Action Committee that we also want to look into a little bit more detail is the idea of requiring permeable paving. There's certainly nothing wrong with permeable paving. If people want to do that, that's great. The issue is that we don't want this to become a substitute for a good drainage program or drainage plan for a residence. Given the nature of our soil content with a lot of clay and without much ground area to absorb rainwater, basically what we get today in Albany is a lot of sheet flow of rainwater over the surface of our lots, and it goes pretty quickly into the street, and that would occur with or without permeable paving. So again, this is a good recommendation from the committee, but we want to do a little bit more research to see, make sure that it's going to make a difference if in fact we require it. With both the panel and the permeable paving, if applicants elect to do that, that's great. It's just whether or not we're requiring it at this stage. So at this point, we'll turn it over to the commission for questions for Michelle and any of us, if we can answer those, and then public comment. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions for staff? Commissioner Jennings.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. That was really informative. I can tell you guys have done a lot of work on this. So one question, I am embarrassed to admit that I don't recall where we stand on the natural gas ban ordinance that we discussed and I believe voted on on this commission a few months ago. Could you provide an update on where that stands and how it relates to this set of measures?
Yeah, I can take the first shot at responding to your question. Shortly after the commission took action, I'm not remembering the exact dates, but we were modeling our recommendation essentially more or less off the model that the city of Berkeley developed. And the litigation was filed against the city of Berkeley,
right,
and challenging the legality of that ban. And our city, we went through a transition with city attorneys at the same time that this was happening. And our current city attorney thought it was prudent to just kind of see how this plays out with the city of Berkeley and the litigation before going down that path of a mandate. We certainly do talk to our applicants about this requirement, encourage them, and as I think you know, we've got a couple of projects that are in the pipeline where applicants have willingly gone forward with an all-electric construction anyhow. But it's until we get a better idea of what the legal issues are and the briefings and so forth that go back and forth, and then we can craft an ordinance that we feel like would be defensible if we were to go forward, and if somebody were to challenge it, we want to be in the best possible position.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. So my other questions were about what the intent is to apply to other types of projects or structures. So you talked about single family, multifamily, and office or retail projects. I am curious how the proposed standards would apply to mixed use, where there's, a commercial use on the ground floor and residential above. Would you apply, each set of measures kind of independently to the separate uses? Is there an intent to apply these standards to ADUs? Is there an intent to apply these standards to, like, if we do have an application come forward for a 100% affordable multifamily project, is the intent to apply the standards to all of those types of projects?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yes, thank you for reminding me about the ADUs. I forgot to mention, we were planning to require these other measures for the ADUs. So we can't, we're kind of limited by the Energy Commission. We can't require any energy efficiency measures because they don't have any studies about that for ADUs. But for the other measures we can, obviously the multifamily parking wouldn't be relevant, but each of these other ones would be. So those would apply to ADUs. For mixed use, I couldn't say for certain. I imagine the planning staff would kind of probably take that on a case-by-case basis. I don't know if Jeff has any thoughts on that, but I imagine it would just sort of depend on the project. And I think that's probably true, if there's some sort of 100% affordable project, maybe there could be exceptions. But
yeah, I think I'd have to look and see exactly how the building code and the green building code handles mixed use buildings. We haven't had a chance actually to work on one of those yet here in town since the implementation of the green building program, mandatory green building program. So we basically we'd apply that, whether it's residential or commercial, we'd apply it based on what the building code tells us to use. And there's always a kind of a safety valve in the process of what's feasible. and particularly with respect to affordable housing, there might be a situation where I would hope not, but theoretically, if there's a situation where the new construction, some of these requirements would be excessively expensive for affordable housing, then we would certainly bring that forward and just talk about an exception process. But for the time being, we're really encouraged by our project that we're working on in Cleveland and Washington, where the applicant is working on and is preparing the final design documents for an all-electric building.
Yeah, and I'll add that I think that's a strength of this is that if you choose to build all electric, the added costs are quite low in most cases. It's really just for those mixed fuel buildings that you can get high added costs from this proposal package.
Thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner.
One of the things I think is odd is the residential lighting requirement, because it's really not gaining anything. I don't think you can even get lighting now, outdoor lighting. You can't buy it that's higher than 3,000 Kelvin. So to require it be less is kind of a moot point. And most of it is very low voltage lighting. So is there really an issue with people using very much lighting in outdoor spaces? So I'm just, not that we can't achieve it, it's just like putting something there we're already achieving, so we're not going to gain anything by requiring it.
Yeah, I don't think that it's necessarily a major issue here. And that's definitely true for some of these other measures as well. Most people are already buying Energy Star.
That's true, yeah.
But I do think it, on the margins, it has some effect, and it's also signaling. When I was talking to the Green Building Subcommittee about it, they kind of, they felt that in some of these cases, it was good to put that in, even if it wasn't going to have a major impact, that it still could be significant and kind of.
It's like putting something on your list.
Thinking about energy efficiency.
Right? Yeah. The question I had was the solar zone, which is really interesting. Is it possible that somebody couldn't do that because Albany lots are some of them are very small and small houses. And others, actually, did you have a solar zone requirement for residential, or is it only for non-residential?
This is only for non-residential.
Okay. All right. So.
Yeah.
Never mind.
And yeah, there are within the green building code, there are exceptions if your entire roof is shaded or something like that. There are already exceptions written into that, so those would apply for this as well.
Great.
Do other commissioners have questions?
Yeah, Doug here. Just about everything here raises the cost of construction and raises the cost of housing, and that I guess that bothers me because the cost of housing and the cost of construction and the cost of materials are so high now, and the cost of permits, and we do see people that get project approvals and then they just can't afford to build them. So the trade-offs here, why don't we just go with what the code requires for statewide and say that's good enough for now, because it's so expensive for people to do renovations in Albany, and so expensive to build new housing that we don't have developers coming in and doing it. I know it's a question of priorities, I guess, but it seems to me if the region and the area, the state, the region is short 1 million housing units, that we shouldn't be increasing the cost of housing. I know we have a climate action plan, and I believe in that. I've done a lot of these things on my own house, actually, but it's like I can afford it. I mean, maybe there should be recommendations strong encouragements, but we ought to have an out for someone who has a young family and is right on the margin and wants to enlarge their house and wants to do it in the most cost-effective way they can do it. We're discouraging that, and that bothers me. Anyway, I don't know the answer to that. I know there's trade-offs between what we're doing here, but I can be energy efficient, and I can have an electric car, but I can afford it, and many other people can too, and that's fine. And this is really good guidance for doing that. But still, we're raising the cost of housing here. We really are, and so I assume that some of these incremental costs for non-residential I don't know if they're per unit or per building or how they come about, but they're big numbers. They're big numbers, and if they're anything close to per unit, they're really big numbers, and that's too much. That'd be too much for me to stomach. So I don't know. It bothers me a little bit. It really does. I think we should go with the minimum the state requires right now, and try to manage, do something to manage the cost of housing a little better. Some incentives to do that, and the city, or have the city put money into this, or have the voters approve something so that we can subsidize the implementation of the climate action plan. I think we should not just, as a public policy way, I think we need to have the public involved and say, if this is your priority, you need to pay for it. You have to pony up, and instead we're trying to do it with the regulations here, and we're just ratcheting up the cost of construction.
We're putting on the backs of the new.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So really quick, we haven't opened it up for public comment yet. Just want to take a check here. Does anyone have any questions? And maybe if we don't have any more, that's okay. If we don't have any more questions,
right.
We'll open it up for public comment, and then we can come back for commission comment.
Sorry. Mm-hmm.
I can also clarify a few of the costs, sort of questions that he brought up as well. If that's helpful. As far as the mixed fuel multifamily building, that's for an 8-unit building. Sort of like a medium size building.
Okay, so it'd be great if that assumption were stated in a footnote or something.
Sorry about that. You can find that in the staff report, I believe, or the appendix. But yes, thanks for bringing that up. And also, I will note that for all of these, this is for new construction rather than renovations. At this point, there's no way to require these added energy efficiency measure requirements on retations. So that's not in the question at all here. But yeah, just to clarify that a little bit. But I absolutely understand the concern.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Chris, do we have anyone who would now like to speak as part of public comment? Let's go ahead and open that up.
I see 4 attendees and there are no hands raised. So if anyone would like to speak, please raise your hand.
We'll just give it a couple seconds here. No one raises their hand, we will close public comment. All right. Seeing none, we will go ahead and close public comment, and we'll turn it back for more conversation. Do any commissioners have any additional thoughts? Yeah, Commissioner McLeod.
Yeah, I was, well, a little background. I was on the Green Building Subcommittee with Tom Cooper and Max Way, and we met a number of times to discuss these issues. And really what you see is a very condensed list from, Michelle could confirm, it was, 150 items perhaps. So we really tried to winnow it down to what would be both cost effective and efficient and just effective in trying to reduce greenhouse gas production. So it's a very short list from what we started with. And these are all based on the tier 1 or tier 2 categories. So we looked at each one line by line and decided or discussed and then decided to include it or not. You know, the goal was to try to do things that were achievable without overly being cost burdensome. You know, so that was a big factor. Some are maybe a little bit more symbolic than others. Perhaps the lighting one is slightly more symbolic than not. And then the other thing we were trying to do is encourage electric buildings, all electric buildings, and discourage the use of gas. And so to that end, when we're looking at some of these EDR margins and things, you can kind of play with a sliding scale as to where you put that margin, and then you can see its effect on cost and its greenhouse gas reductions. So if you go, for example, with the multifamily electric building, the incremental cost basically is zero. So in that sense, you know, we were trying to do things that wouldn't necessarily burden housing costs. But if you want to use gas, then you've got a more difficult road to get there. And that would hopefully steer a developer towards a multifamily electric building, all electric, or single family, all electric, where you can see the incremental cost is pretty low. So, you know, it was a lot of trade-offs, and we had a lot of discussions, and I think we came up with a very condensed list and a pretty effective list. So, you know, it's in line with what a lot of cities around the Bay Area are doing. It's really not pushing it as far as some. I've worked in Palo Alto where it's basically almost all tier 2, you know, and it's a lot more involved, the whole process of getting your building done. You know, you have a lot more checklists and a lot more outside consultants that come in and look at your building. I think this is the kind of thing that's mostly done in the plan check phase, or in the, you know, planning and building permit phase, without a lot of outside people coming in to verify, which would be another layer of difficulty and another layer of cost that we were trying to avoid as well. And I want to thank Jeff for bringing up the idea of the permeable paving and the electrical panel items, because those were things that, as the subcommittee, we recommended. And I think they should still go forward for discussion to the Climate Action Committee. And I know there are some trade-offs there, and it's not totally cut and dried, but in general, I support the upgrade to the 200 amp panel, and that way the project is ready, the house is ready eventually to go all electric, and the marginal cost is not that great. But if you are upgrading your panel, you're subject to PG&E requirements for placement, so that's going to happen no matter what, whether it's a smaller upgrade or a bigger upgrade. And then the big cost would be the PG&E cost for potentially upgrading the wire from the power line to the house. If the current line is really undersized, then they would charge you potentially in the range of $2,000 to $2,500. So that is something to think about. But at the same time, you know, in terms of getting voters to approve something like this, there will be a utility user tax item on the next ballot, which would provide 1/3 of the funds that's raised from this new utility user tax to climate action plans. And that could be a potential source for some kind of this funding if there is something like that that needed to be paid for. That's something that we should investigate going forward. You know, other issues with the panel placement, I think can be worked out. I think it's worth discussing more. And the permeable pavers is just best practice. And Commissioner Kent could also comment on that, but generally you want as much groundwater to soak into much rainwater to soak into the ground as possible. If you have impermeable paving, then you're just sheeting it off and concentrating it somewhere else on the site. So I think permeable paving is a better way to go. So just in general, I think this is a fairly concise list from what we started with. We tried to make it as efficient and effective as possible and as cost effective as possible. And I think they're relatively really just modest steps. I don't think that it's enough to get us to our greenhouse gas reduction goals in the long run, but it's a positive step in the right direction. So I would, encourage us to recommend that council adopt these measures. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks. I did have actually one quick question, just this discussion about the panels. So if this is not for alterations to existing properties, but for new construction, I don't quite understand the upgrading of the panel issue. Because if it's new construction, wouldn't you be?
Yes, good question. Yeah, just to clarify. So the energy efficiency measures that you see here, the EDR and the compliance margins, that's only for new construction. But for the other measures, there are some that are for renovations.
Got it. Okay.
I was just mentioning that because of the cost. So, there are measures here that are for renovations. They're all very low cost. The panel would be renovations only, and there's a cost question regarding that as well. Yeah.
Got it. Great. I don't have any additional comments. I'm supportive of this. To me, for me at least, sort of the line in the sand for the higher dollar value items is really the modifications to existing properties versus new construction. I do think it's really tough, especially with older housing stock that does have mixed energy sources, to be putting high cost burdens on sort of one way or the other when people are trying to make somewhat modest remodels. But for new construction, it's a very different financing situation that people have. And I think, people can make a lower cost choice at that point because you're starting from a blank slate. So I think that's, to me, that's a very different conversation when you're working with a blank slate than when you're working with a remodel. So for those reasons, and I think, again, the costs associated with remodels here, panel aside, which I do think is something that you guys should kind of work through a bit more in terms of a potential exception process, seem sort of de minimis enough that it's not a deterrent for people to be able to adapt their homes or modify their homes for contemporary needs. So I would be supportive of this as well. Are there any, oh yes, Commissioner Jennings.
I'll just say I agree with what Chair Waddy just said with respect to, the difference between remodels and new builds. It's also important for me to clarify that that these energy efficiency measures are not going to apply to ADUs, because I think we don't want to be imposing significant cost burdens on ADUs when we're also trying to encourage those going in. I do think, we have multiple crises. We have a housing crisis and we have a climate crisis. And I'm very sympathetic to what Commissioner Donaldson had to say about the overall costs of construction. And it is, I have somewhat of a concern about adding additional burdens on any residential construction, just given the crisis that we are in, and given how far the Cal Green Code itself has come in the last few years, and how much of the hard work it's already doing to kind of make the housing stock more sustainable. But I think, as long as we're really clear on what the thresholds and triggers are, and we're not applying it to ADUs, we're not applying the efficiency measures to remodels, that again addresses most of my questions or slight, hesitation about this. And then the one thing that I would just mention is, Jeff had mentioned that there's always a safety valve based on what's feasible. And I think just having a little bit of clarity around what that means. You know, in my mind, if there's a backstop of a hardship exemption or some form of relief in the event that, you know, for whatever particular reason, based on the site characteristics or the particular project, it's just not feasible to achieve one of these measures and still make the project pencil. I would hope that there is that safety valve will exist. So I don't know if that's something we need to explicitly provide for, or if you think that mechanism already exists. But that would be my one kind of request or as a comment moving forward.
Great, thanks. Are there any final thoughts from commissioners before we move along? All right.
I'll ask a question maybe. Michelle, did the Climate Action Committee look at any consider any other options or other programs besides working with this code and implementing some tier 1, tier 2 add-ons? Are there any other potential programs that they looked at that would help us meet the climate action goals, incentives for retrofitting solar, helping on a citywide program, not just a state program, but that is something that comes to my mind here, or incentives to replace old gas furnaces with heat pumps. Anything like that, like a big program that might get a lot of people involved and get a lot of bang for the buck. I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can tell you that we're definitely working on it from different fronts. And so, like, for instance, we've got another intern right now who's working on an electrification webpage that is filled with resources for funding and rebates and all kinds of other programs like that. And there are other possible things in the works to that effect. So yeah, we're definitely looking at those types of programs as well.
And if I may add, that in addition to what other agencies are providing that we're trying to tack onto, we realize that if we have some exceptional requirements here, that we also need to have incentives to help make that happen. So they're not on the books yet, but the committee certainly has been talking about it and will be advocating for that as we move forward.
Trying to get my hand. There it is.
Sure. Commissioner Kent.
So how would this be enforced? So Albany's going to make their own checklist that a architect would have to then submit with their building set on top of the LEED and top of the green building code. Albany's going to have another checklist, or is it in addition to that checklist, like a little subcategory?
It would be reviewed at the time of well, we probably for some of these things we probably have some degree of review when it comes before the planning and the zoning commission for the things that affect the design. But the primary review would be at the time of the building permit, and we would have a fact sheet or checklist or something to that effect, so that the applicants know this is what we'll be looking for. And then our plan checker and our building inspector will make sure they're there before sign off.
Okay, I just trying to make sure that the applicant, it doesn't cause another kind of bouncing of plans. They submit it and there's somehow these few items that aren't part of the Cal Green they didn't know about, and it causes them to redo their set and back and forth.
Yeah, we're sensitive to that challenge, and that's why we like to talk to people about it very early on at the early stages of the planning process. A lot of these things don't really become a discussion issue until the building permit, but
yeah, right.
Solar panels or something like that would almost certainly be discussed at the time of the planning review.
Commissioner McLeod, did you have a final comment?
Yeah, a couple of things. In terms of what Doug was asking, as the Green Building Subcommittee, we were just focusing on this right now because it could be adopted fairly quickly. Other programs such as LEED Gold are requiring, I mean, there's Passive House, there's all sorts of other, there's also the Build It Green checklist, which could be updated and expanded. But we've just focused on this at the moment due to the fact that we could get it done and into our building code quickly. And that was part of that. So I think discussions will continue on the other types of green building programs. But the Climate Action Committee, I think they had some other priorities. So, I think it's a little bit on a back burner. So it's in the Climate Action Committee's court at the moment as to how to go forward from here. But this we did because it was easily adopted and quickly adopted, so can be. So that's why we were doing this. And then from what I've seen when I've been submitting building permits is you get a Cal Green checklist and it will have the things that are required marked off and you have to comply with them, or you'll have a series of optional items and you have to do 2 out of 5 or something like that. So it's usually a checklist, and the building department can have that ready to give out, and shouldn't be really any big deal to follow it. So that's it.
All right, great. It looks like that is it for our comments on this item. So with that, we will close this item and move on to item 8 on our agenda, announcements and communications. Item 8-1 is the schedule for SB2.
Yes, just a quick announcement for you. Because the meeting went really well in May, we anticipate coming back to you again in July for the next discussion in the planning process. And so what we would like to do is do what we did previously, start the meeting earlier around 5 to 5:30 and use time in advance of the regular scheduled hearing to work with the consultant, take public comment and make some more progress on this. So I just wanted to make the commission aware when we meet in July, we will be starting a little bit earlier with the intent of focusing on SB2.
With that, we'll move on to item 9 on our agenda. Next meeting, July 22nd. And so we will be starting early on July 22nd. And with that, we are adjourned. So thanks everyone for another successful virtual hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you.